Okay, so welcome everyone. So welcome to this new session in the Global Foresight Summit. My name is Miguel. I'm going to be with you and moderating this roundtable with 5 key experts in foresight in different organizations, supranationals, and governments around the world. Indeed, at this moment, we have people from Singapore, Manila in the Philippines, Chile, and Europe. So we are covering almost every single time zone in the world at this moment where we can have humans, obviously. But the point is that we have with us today Nondas, Christophilopoulos from the Hellenic government, the Greek in Greece. We also have Jaime Cawthorne from the WHO, and she is also based in Manila in the Philippines. We have Arndt Husar, who is based in Singapore and working in the Asian Development Bank. We have Joshua Polchar from the OECD, and I believe that he's based in Paris, but I'm not sure actually.
Normally, yes.
Yeah, okay. And then we have Jaime, who is working for the Chile government and working also in implementation of Foresight. So welcome you all. Welcome from everywhere around the world.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
So today we're going to be spending the next hour talking about why foresight, why foresight is important, and why do governments or big supranationals care about foresight at this moment in time. So I want to start with that question, and who wants to start? Anyone wants to raise the hand first?
Well, if we have... okay.
Sorry, it's me? My time?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, the story, I worked for the National Council of Innovation for Development for the government of Chile, which was founded in 2006 with one question in mind, or a main question in mind, which is a question about the future. What is Chile, a middle-income country, going to do when the copper runs out? Not literally runs out, but when it becomes irrelevant, which is something that happened before in the history of my country when the salt pepper, well, the synthetic salt pepper was invented. So there's this kind of looking to the past and asking the question, well, how can we do it differently towards the future in order to make Chile a developed country, not based only on natural resources?
Okay, so who wants to continue? Nondas, Jaime? What is the role of your organization? You can introduce yourself and tell a little bit who is what are you doing in terms of foresight in your organizations? Why foresight?
Well, maybe I'll start. So I'm not an expert in foresight like the others. We're quite new to this field in WHO and the Western Pacific region, and so we're actually learning from the experiences of the likes of people on this panel as well. And I think there are two things. One is in this region when the governments and WHO were developing a regional strategy to prepare the region for the sort of next phase in development of health and health systems. And this was about 5 years ago. I started to articulate and identify a real need that was unmet from WHO, which was great short-term planning, operational planning for health and health services. We're doing really well, but we feel we need some support in really making sure that we understand where we want to go in the future and that we're making those steps in the right way towards achieving that future. So that was sort of the start of it for the relationship with WHO and the country office, the member states in the Western Pacific. And I think one of the factors that COVID and the pandemic has brought to the fore is how important it is to not just talk about this, to not just have it in a document, but to actually institutionalize sort of strategic foresight and futures thinking in organizations so that they start to change the plans, because the pandemic was never unexpected. It was always there. I'm not a foresight expert, but I'm an infectious disease specialist working originally in sort of pandemic and emerging pathogens. So I can say that was my bread and butter. That's what I was taught when I was at university, and that's what I was working with WHO on. So I think what COVID has really shown is we've got to do much better at that longer term planning. And that's why I think it was something that in health, it was starting to be talked about with WHO and working together with countries in this area. But I think COVID has really made it a big priority, a reality, and people are starting to use the language of futures thinking in a way that I haven't heard before with the people that I work with in the ministries of health. So I think there's an obligation and an opportunity that's come out of recent events.
Thank you, Amy. How is that working from the perspective of a government, Nondas?
Yes, I will build on what Amy said, because the COVID pandemic was a catalyzer also in the case of Greece. Greece is a very specific case in Europe, I would say. I mean, globally, maybe. We have very few foresight practitioners in the country. I would say a handful of foresight practitioners. So I'm one of the pioneers. I work in a research institute. I have the UNESCO chair there. And I was like a lonely fighter, I would say, trying to bring people to understand of what we are doing, what it's about. I was afraid to use the word futurist. That sounds very strange in Greece. Also, the Greek version, it recalls astrologists and this kind of people. And suddenly, in the last 3 months, 4 months, I was really amazed by the quick movement from the Greek government that very quickly set up this unit, this advisory unit under the Prime Minister to work using foresight tools and help bring these tools and these methodologies and increase the capacity on the government level on this field. What is important and what I believe what we are offering as futurist, because I'm really biased, I'm not a government expert, I'm a futurist that I'm now working for the government, is that we try to explain that foresight is not only about using methods and tools and build the scenarios, but it's mainly building this mindset, how you should see the future. And this is the main direction that we are working in these first few months.
That is very good, because when we are talking about not creating methods and tools and setting the mindset and the direction of something, we have with us also the OECD with Josh and Arndt from the Asian Development Bank. We are working in that area. They are trying to make countries more efficient, develop better, and in different regions and very different objectives, obviously. But they are trying to create that sense of creating the culture, the mindset, rather than having a method or a framework. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and a great moment for me to take over and say yes. I work at the OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, and really echoing what Amy was saying as well, taking futures thinking and make it into present doing is really what we're all about. And that's really the other half, I'd like to say, of our work. We talk in OPSI about something we call the impact gap. between strategic foresight and strategic action. And that's the kind of niche where our work really focuses. To return to the question which we're originally tackling, which is why governments are interested in foresight, I like to start my response to this one with saying it's not as if governments aren't already thinking about the future. Every time a government makes a decision or a policy or a law or so on, they're thinking about the future inherently. And there is usually a whole set of assumptions around what's going to work, what's probable, what's ideal, and what's appropriate in implementing those strategies and policies. And really what we're doing in strategic foresight is saying we're going to take those implicit ideas and make them explicit, challenge them, find out what assumptions are underlying them and what flaws and blind spots there might be that could and should be revealed, and indeed broadening the frame of what needs to be taken into account, because the future is full of unprecedented and uncertain and fast-moving challenges. So these are all things that governments are increasingly aware of. They're realizing that their traditional approaches to the kind of plan and pray policy have had mixed records, let's say, in recent years, and that by adopting other approaches, that they stand to be more efficient, more relevant, more legitimate, and indeed more effective in delivering on their mandates. That's generally the mindset that governments have when they approach us in OPSI at the OECD, and we are working with a handful of governments on helping to increase their foresight capacity in that respect. So as the discussion goes along, I'll be happy to drop in a few examples of the work that we're doing.
And what about you, Arndt? We know that you are starting at the foresight capacity at the Asian Development Bank right now. And what is your experience? Why are you deciding to start adopting that capability at this moment?
Yeah, so I made a career move from a development organization to a development bank. And what's very interesting there is that the passion for capability in government to work on strategic foresight and futures is very similar. Both organizations care about that. But when you work for a bank, there's an added layer about, securing your investments, making sure that what you have invested to really has an impact and that you at some point get paid back the loan, right? So there is something very interesting in that dynamic, which I'm exploring myself as a newbie in this institution. And I'm learning how my colleagues perceive and understand foresight and futures. And so what the bank is doing is it is exploring this methodology, this set of methodologies really, and it is trying to create more futures literacy, a general understanding of what the language is, what cultural difference there might be that we have to look at as a banking institution, and then integrate what we can. And a lot of that is still at an exploratory level and ranges from activities at country level, where we work with our developing member countries, that is mostly then government counterparts, to try it out, to explore it, but also within our own operations, trying to apply foresight directly, for example, to the transport sector group and all their activities, and to think through what could be done differently in terms of how we design projects and how we integrate, how we glean insights from futures work. So that's been very interesting as a shift.
It's interesting because when you're talking about the bank and investing, you are always, not as a bank, but when you invest in anything, you wait for something to be right and just get the returns and yield some kind of return on whatever you invest. And that is probably why most of us are invested in the future. We expect things to go somewhere, and usually that somewhere tends to be kind of better compared to where we are today. So What do you think is the goal or expectation? What is the expected output of these type of organizations when they are approaching Foresight?
You mean the bank, or you mean our clients?
Your organizations in general, not only the bank, but the metaphor, it was an interesting one when you say investing. And investing, everyone is investing in the future at the end. So
I see, yeah. That's true. I mean, really, there is a whole set of cultural practices around risk management and around, due diligence on investments. And still, the bank I work for has a development outcome in mind. So it's not a typical bank. But in the passion for the outcomes, we're very much similar to the governments. In the end, we are meant to use the public funds that we have for a public good. We're meant to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. We have operational priorities that we chase. And so a lot of what Foresight can contribute is really that focus on the preferred future. And that is something very interesting for our colleagues who are working on strategy, who are working with countries on long-term plans, and integrating Foresight there really makes a lot of sense. It's just a natural fit.
And what about an organization like the one Jaime is working for? What is the expected goal or output for someone like the WHO or your region, the specific dialogue you want to maintain with other organizations around you?
I think this is very much set in those early discussions between the office I work in and the Ministries of Health in the region, which was really about making sure that in 20 to 30 years' time, the countries in the region have secured the best future for the health and well-being of their populations and a health system that's appropriate to the needs of that society. And I think that historically, a lot of the thinking had been rather linear and siloed in health. And I maybe reflect on my own personal journey as an epidemiologist. We're very focused on our disease area or the way in which we interact with the health system and the bit that we work in, and you plan out from there. And I think one of the real benefits of bringing strategic foresight and futures thinking much more closely into the world of public health and the curative sector and the health system as a whole is that we're going to be much more likely to achieve those outcomes than if we see everything in this sort of modeled, predictable, linear way in which I think a lot of our thinking had gone. Now, there are challenges in that. And, I was talking to one of your colleagues, Sohail, who's one of the futures experts. And he was saying, in his experience, a lot of the people who work in public health and health are a little bit like law enforcement. And so that journey that you need to go on can be a little bit challenging because we're used to a lot of certainty, to reducing uncertainty that's terribly uncomfortable. And this approach is really taking a lot of us out of our comfort zones. So as well as wanting to achieve these big sort of strategic aims for the future of health and well-being across the region, I think there's another part of that, which is through this process that we're working with governments on, we actually want to build that futures literacy and that change in mindset where you start to be a bit more comfortable with uncertainty and identifying multiple scenarios and being comfortable in selecting one that might be preferred and debunking a lot of the futures language and terminology and bringing it back to what it is, which is an incredibly logical process that you can work through with governments to achieve a longer term vision for the future.
So we can probably go to include one of the questions that we have on the chat is within governments that these types of bigger organizations focus a little bit less on the outcomes and introduce foresight in a different concept. Is that it shouldn't be about bettering rather than the before or the after, or is this a cycle of turning governments into organizations when you are expecting outputs of something? What are you thinking here, Nondas?
This is exactly right, and this is something that we work a lot, and I'm really happy that we have a very good understanding in the government level. But usually, what they expect by teams like us is they expect us to just produce scenario and tell them what to do, and prepare them for the next crisis or prepare them for the next black swan. So there is a lot of work. And I always keep saying that in our ethical code, we are not allowed to say that we can predict the future or we can say what will happen. So we must always, no matter how much times it needs, we should repeat it, that what we do is we work with our mindset. We need to be prepared to hug uncertainty, and this is what we ought to do. But I see that the same problem is in many cases. I see that the European Commission, now that they have established this Foresight network, they also start with this approach, producing reports and producing scenarios and producing studies, which is not bad. Everything helps to build capacity on the field, but this is only the first step. So the second step, after understanding the basic, let's say, terms or the basic problems, the second step would be to build this mindset. And we should always keep this in our minds.
That is extremely interesting, because the approach of the European Union is very different to other parts of the world. So there is like a consensus that Foresight might be interesting. So how is a Latin American government working with that context? How are you managing Foresight? Jaime, what is the expected output of Foresight and how does it relate to your work?
Well, actually, where the place I work for, we are not specifically tasked with making Foresight exercises, but we must look into the future and advise the President of the Republic on matters of science and technology and innovation. The thing that we have identified is that previously, and still today, the government is focused on the government agencies and institutions are focused on the linear thinking of the future, just like Nondas said. I mean, like focusing on things that they want to happen and give me the tips. Tell me how the future is going to play out in this field. But what we have done before, and we are getting more invested in that, is to build the capacity in public agencies in order to see what open the framework with which they are looking into the future. For example, I mean, and with the goal that the government had when they founded the Council of transforming the country. Well, you cannot transform something if you have a linear thinking. If you're just looking, for example, for the mining sector to develop or the agricultural sector to develop, you're not going to transform the country if you're not able to see a future where that country might be transformed. So that's why we reached out and we connected with Real Miller and the Futures Literacy Framework, and we began to build a capacity within the council to connect with the institutions and help them make, just like Josh said, make them their assumptions explicit and open up their ways of looking into the future. And right now, we have a very potent weapon, I would say. I don't like that word, but forgive my English, or tool. From the next year, the strategies or the official documents of the council, which is tasked to look into the future, are going to be the legal framework for every public policy on science, technology, and innovation. So we hope we will have a lot more work and impact in this field.
And here I want to also listen to what George has to say, because he's working at cross governments. So you can see him cross-pollinating different governments from the OECD. So what are your expectations of these type of goals and expected output? We've already heard many of them, but how do you see that context?
I'm really glad you asked me the question in that way, because it also means I get to talk a bit about what motivates me in being a strategic foresight practitioner. But first I'll zoom out and say, well, look, the OECD has a very clear mission statement. It's better policies for better lives. And we're all about using strategic foresight to that end. So we're supporting governments in embedding strategic foresight in their policy processes with the very clear intention of achieving better lives as the output of that. But governments have a fundamental strategic problem in the sense that they kind of have to be all things to all people. Multiple missions, multiple strategies. Think about the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. There's this whole list of things that governments are setting out to achieve. And there are massive trade-offs in any action that any organization takes. And strong partisanship isn't something we go in for at the OECD. So we do find ourselves challenged in terms of turning great ideas into great action. But talking more personally about what I'm in this business for is really the mutual learning process. I'm not here to say that strategic foresight should be put to the service of any particular goal or outcome. And I'm referring also to some of the comments in the chat about capacity and cycles and outcome-oriented work. What really does it for me is mutual learning and finding out more about what others in different fields are experiencing and what expertise they have to bring to bear. And the ways in which strategic foresight can reframe it, add to it, expand to it, and give it greater effect and impact. And they will take from that process what they have learned. And that might be a greater sensitivity to signals of future change. It might be shared narratives of success so that they're able to then take plans forward and have a greater chance of achieving whatever it is they intended to achieve. The ability to stress test plans against potential future disruptions, a renewed vigor to do things now and to innovate and to try things out that previously might not have been considered, or returning indeed to what Amy was referring to just now, which is a kind of comfort with discomfort in the uncertainty of this fast-moving and uncertain world that we live in. So that's what really does it for me. And I think there is a kind of mutual benefit there to seeing foresight as both a process and something at the service of particular outcomes.
It's interesting because if you look at the comments in the chat, there is a perception on the electoral cycles. And the future obviously does not fit in 4 years. It doesn't. So cycles and choosing people that is going to be running the countries and making decisions happens in 4-year cycles. So how can you make sure that any activity, any culture, any mindset, any effort that you are putting in place to look into the long term is not taken under any type of consideration to be removed when you look at the short term of a new coming government, or even the one that it's repeating? It's a completely different thing. And in organizations, probably it happens the same with the leadership and management layers. They change quite often. When we say 4 or 5 years, usually faster than the time it takes for the future to happen. So how are you dealing with this short-term versus long-term thinking and the silos it creates, and how it affects foresight, strategic decision-making, and policy-making? Who wants to go first?
I can jump back in if... Okay. Oh, I see Arndt is...
I'm being featured, so I'm going to take the floor. I love this question because I think it matters for all of us, no matter if we're sitting in a government or supporting governments, but even for considering that we also have funding cycles and development agencies that also put us into boxes. I think that it's a struggle that, is that we can't do away with. There is a need for humans to somehow create a foreseeable framework within which you can take action. So for me, it's more about how we set up our processes and our foresight activities in a way that you have things that you go through with the entire group and as many of the other parties, if it's in a political space, as possible, as inclusive as possible, so that you bring people into the room from the beginning who might later oppose the previous leadership. And therefore, I think it's about inclusion and about participation. But what I find very interesting at the moment is that because of COVID, the future and what we used to work on in Foresight has kind of shrunk. We used to look at longer term futures. And right now, the discussion that we're having with counterparts, I feel like the disruption of COVID was so much that we're really not able to go as far out, and that we are using futures methodologies and tools to look at the nearer future. And that makes it a very interesting dynamic if you match that with election cycles or planning horizons or funding cycles.
Great. Who wants to follow? Josh?
Can I jump in on that one then? Because I'd really like to pick up on what Arndt was saying about the kind of COVID paradox, that we hear all this short-term, long-term things. I mean, the first thing I should say is, thank goodness we have electoral cycles. Thank goodness we have time limits on decisions being taken and when we can go back and review things. Thank goodness that most of the decisions we take are reversible and that we are able to change course, because contexts change. And it's absolutely right that when the facts change, we're able to change our minds and our actions with them. So in that sense, I think we should be careful before we bemoan the existence of electoral cycles too much. That said, there is no doubt that certain planning periods are artificial, and that kind of artificiality in planning results in an artificiality in our futures thinking. And that is something that's institutionalized and is very hard to overcome through a kind of through methodologies and tools in strategic foresight. And I'm sure we're going to come on later in this conversation to the relationship between futures thinking and institutions. I also see a question in the comments asking us to discuss how to increase the chances that foresight work will be adopted and taken forward rather than going unused within institutions. And we're really working very hard on that within OPSI in our anticipatory innovation governance framework. My personal thinking about this is that long-term and short-term are often misused as concepts when really what is meant is action versus inaction. Something tends to get labeled as long-term when there is an intention to leave it to the future and someone else, somewhere else, someone else to deal with. And that's not really what long-term could and should be about. So the answer, I guess, to the conundrum is institutionalizing the practice of strategic foresight more, and that's really what we're focusing on. I'll pause there and listen to what some of our colleagues have to say about it, and come back and talk a bit more about anticipatory innovation governance in a bit.
Yes, indeed, anticipatory, it's something that most citizens feel like government should be doing. It's anticipating the needs of the citizenship. And also happens the same for the WHO, for example. They should be anticipating things. There is this whole dynamic of anticipatory thinking for everything, which is very related to this short-term versus long-term, as you said, Josh. How are you approaching this, Nondas or Amy? Who wants to go? Amy? You're on mute.
I was just saying, Nondas, you take the turn first. I took it last time.
Thank you. I would just take it because I want to build on what Joshua said. In our case, it was very important the role, for the establishment of the unit was very important the role of the organizations like OECD, the EU, and UNESCO. The efforts lately of all these three organizations to support the field of strategic foresight and futures literacy, if we are talking about UNESCO, had helped a lot to create this unit in Greece and to increase capacity. So I believe that these three organizations, I'm putting EU in the case of Europe, they can play a very important role to help governments include this kind of policy making using strategic foresight in their everyday activities. And I would say, and I will just reply very quickly in some of the comments that I see some amazing comments. I don't think we have the time to reply on them, but about election cycles, it is correct. It is a huge problem. We try to explain that it's not about planning only, but is also doing things today, innovate today using this kind of tools. It's very important also to explain that it's not like a closed committee of experts that design the future, but it's about participation. In Greece, in the ancient times, we had the Oracle of Delphi, so every strategic decision was taken there in closed doors. Nobody knows. So this is something different, and this is something that we need to explain very well to the society. That is something that we have all together to work and imagine the future. And I think I can give the floor to Amy. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Nondas. So I think I'm going to build on some of the things that you and Josh have mentioned, because these are just some reflections from what we've been experiencing with governments in the last couple of years. First of all, there's always some people that don't change. Budget cycles may come and go, elections may come and go, people in the top may come and go. But there are a group of people, certainly within the health sector, who may be in different jobs, but they're still there. And they're still there after 15 to 20 years. When I left the region in 2011 and come back this year, this time, a lot of the counterparts may be in different jobs, but they're still the same people. And I think that gives us hope that some of the institutionalized futures thinking can become embedded in the system, because that's part of what we need to do, so that that foresight and futures thinking doesn't just remain in a little box attached to planning. It has to be owned and understood and embedded in the work of all of the groups that make up whichever bit of the government you're working with. So in my area, it will be health. So the public health specialists, the clinical leads, the epidemiologists, the strategic thinkers, the planners, it all has to be, all those people have to be brought into the process. And I think one of the things that we're working on with Mongolia, where we're currently working on a big foresight project, is to identify some of those key groups, key stakeholders that will be the sort of backbone to the process beyond the next 2 years, but not beyond the next 5 years, and up sort of to the 10 and 15 years cycle. So I do think there are ways in which you can embed in the design and the way that you work within governments to identify those key people, to start to reach out beyond the traditional boxes where this sort of approach gets often put, and make it sort of more embedded into the mainstream. So I think I'll finish there with those few reflections.
No, it's super interesting, because there is something in there that sometimes, and you started with this, Amy, at the very beginning, saying that, for example, the pandemic was already, we knew this could, not only that it could happen, that it was going to happen. It was a matter of when, not what. It's the only thing, and we know that it's going to happen again. So we are just having this. When we think about this operational and tactical attitude towards managing something versus strategizing for the long term, we have a few comments in here that are really interesting, because most of the times we talk of our governments and organizations as if they are something that they think on their own, but they are made of people. And people, most of the time, they tend to focus on their narrow view, and they are sometimes very, very not so open to alternative futures, alternative things, and new ways of doing things. So foresight is sometimes presenting uncertain and uncomfortable scenarios that might challenge what you have today and what you think today. So how do you deal with that level of being uncomfortable and communicating it within the organizations so they can make any type of progress towards an alternative future, change the paradigm, shift somewhere? Who wants to go? Josh is moving the head a lot. Jaime wants to go too. He's been silent for a few minutes, so we go with Jaime.
Thank you, Miguel. Well, what we have done in the past is to convene a group of diverse people. I mean, people from the government, from past government, from the academia, from the public, from the private sector, from the territories, for people from the cities, from the towns, small towns. For example, around resilience. This was a topic that was not part of the government years ago. And we identified as a problem for the future of the country. Actually, Darwin identified it as a problem for Chile when he was here in 1835 and in the middle of a huge earthquake. So what we were able to do was to present a view of the future that also took care of the short-term versus long-term thing, because people from all over the country were thinking about this. And we were able to push forward a very future-oriented agenda around resilience, founding a national institute and several programs and public policies around different agencies. There was a big effort that is having a big impact, and helped the government see that they were not taking into account a very important concern for the Chilean people.
Okay, Josh, how you want to add to the conversation?
Yeah, these are challenges that I think all of us are always going to face, because there's something quite human about confirmation bias and feeling comfort in having your existing plans validated, which is not the purpose of strategic foresight. We might help organizations to better achieve their objectives, but we might also create uncomfortable knowledge about the way that they're trying to do that. Returning to both Amy and Jaime's comments about ownership and legitimacy, these are really fundamental parts of strategic foresight, because the future is not objective. It's not out there waiting to be studied and passively analyzed as if it was data of the past. And by the way, in response to one of the questions in the comments, all research methods have implicit biases built into them, whether they accept that or not. And I think strategic foresight actually, when it's done well, has the humility to say there are all kinds of biases in the scenarios that we're creating, for example, or the visions that we're building. And we're going to make them explicit, and we're going to challenge them, and we're going to create alternative scenarios which present a future that would really contradict some of our most strongly held beliefs about the way in which the world works, should work, could work in the future. That's what creates debate. That's what creates constructive disagreement. And for me, those are parts of democracy. Those are the lifeblood through which we are able to come to agreements and to govern ourselves in more peaceful and collaborative ways. And I think that's necessary all the more when we are talking about processes that may transcend electoral cycles. There has to be that additional democratic backbone to the foresight work that we're doing. So there's no simple answer, unfortunately, but it is important to remind organizations why they're engaging in strategic foresight, and not to be under any illusion that strategic foresight is there to come in and service their existing agendas.
So here we go into an interesting side of the biased, objective, and subjective approach to the future. Obviously, we are humans, we have biases, and we don't know it. If we know that there is a bias, we can solve it. But actually, we discovered one day that we have some bias, and we try to do our best to just remove it, okay? But how are you reflecting this concept of participatory futures, having citizenship? As you said, in democracy, we are voting for our people in the government to make the decisions in our name. How do you choose your team? How do you include citizenship? How do you create all those relationships into the overall human community of a certain nation or body in order for that future to be a little bit less biased, a little bit more objective? Who wants to go? Nondas, I unmute you. Yeah.
If I can comment a bit on this, because I see also some comments in the chat, and this is on a personal level. When I started building my team, I'm a physicist, so my original degree is physics. I have someone in my team who is a mechanical engineer. I have an archaeologist. I have someone on social sciences. So I'm trying to build a really diverse team, because this is how we must try to address this issue, have like diverse views. And this is going to be always a problem. And no matter what to do, we cannot really 100% address it, but we can try to have as many different views as possible. And I will close with just one dimension that we usually don't pay too much attention. It's not only the future that we imagine in different ways, having different anticipatory assumptions. This is the same thing we do about the past. And then thinking of the past in different ways also affects how we think about the future. Imagine different events, parts of history that have happened, and how different people translate those events in different ways. This is another dimension. So this is everywhere. We cannot really address it. We have to be open in polyphony and be open to change our opinion, our views on an issue in every single moment without any regret.
I want to pass the turn to Jaime, because I know she's been working on foresight, approaching the history side. So a very historian approach into the past and how it's being transformed into the future, given the epidemics, pandemics, and all that. It's a very, very interesting topic. So, Jaime, what can you add to that interest of Nondas, not only looking into the future, but also looking into the past?
Yeah, and I think it reflects one of the comments in the chat as well around involving a diverse population and different ways of thinking and looking at foresight initiatives. And so what we did was we ran a series of think tanks looking at the future through different lenses, involving it was much more of a technical group of people working in specific areas in health. And that was applying foresight techniques, looking at the future and saying, how is the pandemic going to shift the future scenarios in the Western Pacific? But in order to sense check it, and also to make decision makers who would be using the end results of the foresight process more comfortable with perhaps considering more of the controversial or what might be considered far-fetched scenarios, we actually then got a group of medical historians who specialize in unpicking the impacts of previous large-scale epidemics and pandemics. And we got them to look back in history at previous events and say, how much did those events shift the society, the economy, technology? And we got them to look through the sorts of lenses that our Foresight exercises had identified and had identified the sort of dimensions of change. And that was actually a very powerful tool to help decision makers in our organization to really be able to say, actually, that's not a totally off the wall idea in a scenario, because, hey, look what happened in the plague in Egypt, where an entire civilization was wiped out. Or look at how previous pandemics led to the creation of health systems and hospitals and ICUs. I mean, these were big innovations that we're still living with and shape our health systems. So I mean, I think this was perhaps a different take, because it still involved a lot of people working in health. But what it did was it reinforced the reality of the different potential scenarios and how those really were viable types of scenarios, and history showed us this. And I think what we then moved on to was an extension to say, well, the future of health doesn't necessarily belong to the people making the decisions right now. It belongs to young people. And so one of the things we're also trying to encourage through the work with countries is to involve young people in thinking about the future of health and health systems and well-being that they want to see in countries. Because really, by the time you would achieve that preferred future, these young people are going to be the ones giving birth in hospitals or developing the first signs of non-communicable diseases and having to manage those diseases, or making decisions about the lives they want to live and how they want to interact with services much more. So just a few thoughts about diversifying that view.
It's interesting because it goes back to questioning everything. You don't question only what is going to happen in front of you, but what happened behind you too. So that is interesting, because when you think about questioning things and establishing a foresight unit inside any type of institution and the size of the institutions that you are working for, what are the most common asked questions that you are unable to answer? That everyone that is investing in your team or is giving you the budget or is creating the project, whoever, what is the most common question that you can never answer? So we start with Arndt this time because he's starting with a new Foresight unit, and probably it's an interesting topic at this moment in time.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the questions that I'm being asked a lot is, where exactly will this take me? And that's a very interesting one. For those of us who work in Foresight, we know it's kind of an exploration, it's a journey. And you don't really know at the beginning where you're going to end up. So this question comes a lot from my peers who haven't done Foresight before. And so when we talk through what the activities entail, what we're going to do, there begins to, or an understanding grows that really what we're doing is bringing more complexity into their process. And there's initially a bit of an averse reaction. So I'm expanding a little bit on the cultural shifts that are required in an organization to pick up on Foresight. That I feel very strongly. And that was similar also when I was working with governments, and particularly developing countries. This question whether the engaging Foresight is going to unsettle things, and the little time people have available and the little resources they have available, is it really worth spending time on it? So I was often challenged whether this is a kind of fancy tool that developing countries and in developing country context shouldn't be really delved into because it consumes resources and time. We took the opposite position and said that actually in those contexts it's hugely important, so that we actually better manage the disruption that countries are facing, oftentimes with much less resources at their disposal to respond. So anticipatory governance skills and so on are hugely important. I'm digressing, but the question I'm asked most is really like, before I get into this, what are you doing with me? And there needs to be some openness to engage before you get started.
Joshua,
I can pick up from here, and the question I hear most is very closely related to the one that Arndt hears, which is proof that it has an impact, proof that there have been times in the past where foresight saved the world, or at least had consequences that were much more positive than otherwise would have occurred. And that's such a difficult thing to do, because strategic foresight thinking, we're always advocating for it to be embedded within the process. So if it's so closely interwoven and intertwined in people's thinking, it's quite difficult to put your finger on exactly what the breakthrough moment was that foresight allowed to happen. It's kind of like asking an airline to prove that studying physics is what made the plane fly. Of course, it's there. It's all over. The proof is all over. But you just can't see it. And the only time you will see it is if it goes wrong. And then, my goodness, will you see it? And it's the same. We know that when things go wrong, people often blame a misattributed sense of future or unwise or unskilled assumptions about the future in retrospect. But of course, foresight is otherwise known as prospective thinking, so it's very difficult to prospectively prove that what you're doing is going to have a positive impact. Realizing this is probably the last intervention I'll make, so I do want to quickly spark off what Amy and someone else in the chat was saying about having people believe what you're saying. I have two techniques for that.
I want to do a thing with you first, because we have around 5 minutes. And I want to do one tiny little game for each of you.
Okay.
So imagine that you are talking to your past self and you are coming from the future. So you are bound and headed to establish the foresight unit that you have now, or the one that you're going to have in 5 years, okay? So just to close, in as short as possible, I will say in a tweet, but how you measure a tweet when you are talking. What will be the advice to your own self in establishing this type of unit, given your current knowledge or even future knowledge about what are going to be the issues, the gains, the pains, and the happy moments in this moment? So we go, as we have it on the screen, I believe everyone has it in the same way. And after that, we are going to be closing the session. So we go with you, Nondas, a simple tweet to recommend your own self. What are the best things to do? Wait, you're on mute.
And the only advice I would give is you should have started earlier.
That is a very good one. Always start early. Amy?
Do you know what? It was the one thing I was going to say. Start before the pandemic hits. I think I would have gone back and shaken myself a bit and said get into foresight, strategic foresight earlier in your career.
Okay, I have Jaime here.
I would say you have no idea about what's happening right now. You're never going to be able to figure this out. So ditch the crystal ball and be prepared for everything. Open your mind.
Arndt, I'm going to go Arndt and leave Joshua for the last one.
I might say instead of starting with big pieces, start very small and do many little projects before you communicate to the organization the worth of foresight.
Okay, and we end with Josh. What is your recommendation for you, for your own self?
You don't have to believe any particular version of the future. It doesn't even have to be a unit. What counts is the action and the foresight processes that you set in motion. So that's a fantastic moment for me to say, next session, The title is Act Before You're Ready, and Piret Tunarist and I from the OECD will be presenting that session. So anticipatory innovation governance, acting before you're ready, embedding the practice of acting upon the future in governments and other institutions, coming up in just a few moments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. That is exactly why I wanted you to end the last one. It's because, yes, as Nondas said, start earlier, even before you know that you have to do something. So thank you, all of you, so much. You've seen the chat. There is a lot of questions that were not touched. I wish we had 2 or 3 hours to keep going through all the questions, because those are really, really interesting. And we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And everyone else, to the audience, you can keep on the same page, refresh the website, and you will get into the new session with Josh and Piret. Thank you, everyone.